Hello, my name is Blackwater ASMR. Today, for my first video, I figured I would read Call of Cthulhu. It is a very popular H.P. Lovecraft piece. It's probably one of my favorite horror stories because of how much lore is behind it, especially nowadays. Lots of people know who Cthulhu is. So I'm just gonna jump into the story, start from the beginning, get as far as I can get. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, so I will get as far as I can, and hopefully this is relaxing. So The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Part 1, The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity. It was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day, piecing together disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall go either mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden eons, which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dreaded glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things, in this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 1927, with the death of my grand-uncle, George Gamel Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity. I don't know where I was right there. Obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a short-cut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find a visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my grand-uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will later be published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from shewing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried in his pocket. Then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of a queer clay bas-relief and disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculpture responsible for this apparent disturbance of the old man's peace. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick, and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for though the vagaries of Cubism and Futurism are many and wild, they do not often produce the cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. In writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs seem certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or to even hit at its most remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of a monster, or symbol representing monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneously pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be faithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was set aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angel's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925 Dream and Dreamwork of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Benfield Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS Manager, MTG. I won't even say it. Notes on same and Professor Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemura, and the rest comments on long surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Gold Bow and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre, mental illness, and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angel bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and living alone at the Fleur de Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of unknown genius, but great eccentricity, Yeah, you get what I'm saying. I'm so terrible at pronouncing things, especially it's cut up by the book, so it's like not the full word. Anyway, that's not an excuse. I just can't read. And had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the stated folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility, and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of the host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested poise and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some kindness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him record its verbatim, was a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, of the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale, which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, and the most considerably felt in New England for years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatagan. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. I don't know that language. I can't remember the name of it. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angel. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied with an almost frantic intensity the bas relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his night clothes when waking had stolen bewildering him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults and societies. And Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread, mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatical sense impacts, uninscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Reli, or however you pronounce that. Alright, that'll be enough for today. I'll probably pick this up again in another video, so good night and sweet dreams.